WNST, Towson, Baltimore, and Baltimore Positive. We are getting the Maryland Crab Cake Tour back out on the road. It's all brought to you by our friends at the Maryland Lottery. I got my scratch-offs with Betty Boop. I got my Goodwill shirt on, and our friends at Window Nation. We're going to be doing it on Wednesday, the 18th, in advance of the Preakness. Maybe we'll have a rich strike on Wednesday, have a comeback vegan crab cake. We're going to be joined by Brooke Learman. I think Tharu Vignaraj is also going to be joining us on the 18th. That's at the Land of Kush, vegan crab cakes downtown. Luke Jones is here. I've seen him eat real crab cakes, although vegan crab cake probably not offensive. We're looking forward to trying new things and expanding our palate. And we're going to expand our palate downtown if we get a chance to do that. Maybe Adley Rutschman will be expanding things downtown. Luke, I went to the Oriole game the other night. You weren't even there. What's going on, man?
I was there.
Were you there?
I didn't see you were there until much later in the game. So we missed each other.
I peered into that empty press box, and you must have been eating free hot dogs or something.
I must have been. I don't know. Maybe in the bathroom or something like that.
Well, there weren't a whole lot of people there. I did get to see everybody that was there on Thursday night.
Yeah, and I mean, it's not exactly a big shock. I mean, you're talking about the Minnesota Twins, who, for as good as they are, certainly not the Yankees, the Red Sox. If the Dodgers were to come into town, something like that. And look, I mean, the reality of this is we're 4 or 5 years into the Orioles being bad. And even if I think if you watch on a nightly basis, there have been some things to like this year, maybe a little more so than in the past, but it still isn't equating to looking all that great in the standings. Although doing better than the Boston Red Sox, who are an absolute mess to start 2022. They had the
game won on Sunday, had a doubleheader, would have won if they're not kicking the ball around late in the game.
Sure.
That part of it was I want to be a smart ass because they're just awful and they've been awful people just in general. So anytime I get a cheap shot in, I've taken it for 20 years. But in this particular case, it's like, the pitching isn't good. The hitting isn't good. The Wall's taking home runs away as we knew it would. It'll give some and take some and all that stuff. But the defense is one of those things that, like, when you're losing games because of defense, that's something I can't write down. I can't figure that part of it out.
Well, sure. And I'd actually, based on what we've seen, the pitching has actually been pretty good this year. Now, do I think that's going to continue in every case? When you look at these guys individual by individual, no. But the pitching, by and large, has been pretty good overall. And certainly they've had some stretches where it's been really good. The offense has come on here of late, and certainly you can look at the top 4 or 5 spots in the lineup you feel good about, but then you look at the bottom of the lineup, not so good. And it kind of brings it to what you were just talking about. You look at the infield, and I'm not talking for Mancini at first base, but second base, shortstop, third base. I like Jorge Mateo's defense overall. He's had some lapses here and there, as any young player is apt to do. But I think for the most part, you see potential in him from a defensive standpoint. Now, is he going to hit enough? I think that's certainly a major question mark. But the rest of these guys, and look, maybe I was a little too sold on Ramon Urias based on what he did last year. Hasn't been off to a particularly good start. But we've already seen Kelvin Gutierrez get DFA'd. Rougned Odor has had a couple moments where you'd say, okay, rest of it's been not so good.
Some of it's been
to your point, yeah, exactly. But to your point, you look at the infield defense overall, and certainly you're not getting much from any of the. We're not talking just bad, run-of-the-mill bad, but below the bar, and that's where right now you're looking at Gunnar Henderson at Double-A and Jordan Westberg, although he's off to a little bit of a slower start, and some of the other infielders they have at different levels, and say, okay, they can't get here fast enough, because you look at the rest of this thing, and again, not that the lineup has been great, and certainly it's only been of late where some guys have really picked it up. We've seen Mullins over the last several games really start to hit. Austin Hayes is having a really nice start to the season, and we've seen Mountcastle put together some good at-bats here of late. But you kind of look at that, a walk, an on-base percentage standpoint, which this is a guy who came into this season with a 290 career on-base percentage, and he's already approaching a career high in walks, as far as where he is already. So you've seen a transformation of some sort there. So you look at the top 5 or 6 spots in the lineup right now and say, okay, not saying that that's playoff or World Series caliber quality, but there is some quality there. it's those bottom few spots, and that's where it brings us to what we're all talking about right now, and we'll continue to make debut, whether it's the 16th against the Yankees, whether it's later that week, whether it's over the weekend with Preakness and all of that. We assume Adley Rutschman's coming, right? I mean, he's at AAA now. They expedited his, they moved him up from AA Bowie over the weekend because of the weather being so lousy here locally, and he got a chance to play in some games for Norfolk against Nashville. My assumption is he'll make his debut at home, as the Orioles are on the road going to St. Louis and Detroit. But there's a lot of excitement there. And what it means from a symbolic standpoint is obvious, right? I mean, we're all going to think back to 2009 and Matt Wieters, but the difference here is that era of Orioles baseball, one of my biggest points of contention was always they're kind of stuck in between, right? They were kind of you trade Eric Bedard, but then you go sign a couple veteran free, they never really had a set path or direction that you could really tell. I mean, and Andy McPhail, to his credit, did quietly get them on that path, and then Dan Duquette continued that, and they had some good years under Buck.
To your point,
Showalter.
the quiet path would be dealing for Hardy, grabbing Chris Davis for a bag of baseballs, and thinking maybe one day he'll be an everyday player, right? Like those were guys, Miguel Gonzalez, Wei and Shen. They stocked up guys, and that happened for them, right? The right-hander that threw from underneath, the submariner. They went out, they got bullpen arms. They were all about bullpen arms, right? They were always the team stocking up on 5 relief pitchers because they could afford them.
Well, and in some ways you could talk about affordability, which look, analytics and all of that, that's part of this, right? I mean, it absolutely is. You're trying to be as efficient as possible. It's one area where the Orioles, you kind of look at what baseball has become over the last decade. You could even say they were a little bit ahead of the curve in that way. Now, you still want starting pitching, and that's why Grayson Rodriguez is going to be so important, and DL Hall is going to be so important. And we've seen Kyle Bradish, a little up and down since he's been caught up, but I think things alike when you've seen him on the mound. But you know that there's going to be a lot of that bulk pitching and guys out of the bullpen, and we've seen Keegan Aiken transition into that role this year, and he's done a pretty nice job so far. But I go back to Adley Rutschman, what that means from a symbolic standpoint. I mean, it's the Captain Obvious statement. I mean, we've been waiting, and so much of this losing over the last 4 or 5 years has just felt where it's, no end in sight, right? I mean, no light at the end of the tunnel. I mean, you can talk about prospects, but if they're down at single A or double A, they're still a couple years away. And, I think it's really tough. And especially when you look at how this is played out elsewhere. I mean, my pastor is a diehard Pittsburgh Pirates fan, and he always jokes they've been rebuilding for the last 30 years. I mean, you think back to, Barry Bonds not being able to throw out, the runner at the plate, and the Braves move on to the World Series, and the Pirates, they had a couple fleeting years.
Do you know that story? Have I ever told you the Sid Bream story?
No.
So that's 1992.
Mm-hmm.
And this first year I really covered the team. I was in the locker room all year long and knew all the players. Cheeto Martinez, Rick Sutcliffe, Ben McDonald's on that team. The end of that year, keep in mind I'm 23 years old, right? So, and I love baseball. There's no football here. Baseball's my whole world. I've been working at the paper 8 years. I'm finally doing radio. I got long hair. David Segui, because every player could buy tickets for the postseason, David Segui said to me, "Hey, if you want postseason tickets, I'll get you a strip of tickets for you and your buddies, whatever." I literally had 4 strips of Pittsburgh Pirates World Series tickets that I had, like I physically had them. Like I made Xerox copies of them before I sent them back to get my $35 a ticket back or whatever, $240 a strip, however outrageous the money was in 1992. But when that Sid Bream thing happened and he slid in safe under Spanky and all that stuff, Lavalier, I'm like, great. My World Series are kindling paper. Now I went to 100 World Series games after that. I had life. I went in 93, went to every game in Philadelphia and Toronto, and on and on and on and on for a decade, right? Until the Orioles threw me out. But that play was, we were so devastated. All my buddies were watching the game. And we had World Series tickets. We thought we were going to Pittsburgh to see the World Series. We had tickets for 1, 2, 6, and 7, I think, or maybe it's 3, 4, 5, whatever the games were. But we were going to the real World Series because, like, the Orioles, This is after 88, 89, the whole thing. It had been since 79, 83. So sitting on World Series tickets and being able to drive to a World Series game, that's a big deal. So don't short shrift that. So tell your pastor that I suffered too back there because of the Pirates in 92.
But the point is, the point I was trying to make is you don't know when it's going to be over. And look at how that ended. What had been a very successful 20 plus year run, go from Clemente and Pop Stargell and 1979, and I'm not trying to bring that up to depress Orioles
Maybe
fans
your
with that
pastor
one.
deserves to pound it for 30 years then, man. The more you bring it up, now you're going to 79.
Hey,
maybe I'm not unhappy about 92 all of a sudden.
Let's be very clear about this.
It's been 30 years, and if you really had those tickets 30 years later, you got nothing.
But the point is, when it ends, you don't always know it's over, right? I mean,
no doubt.
It's just, think back to
Zach Britton.
Exactly. But even 2 years before that, and I remember sitting in the hotel room in Kansas City doing post-game radio when the Orioles had been swept by the Royals. And, even though they had the wild card 2 years later, that really felt like their best last chance, to with that group to get to a World Series. I mean, the stars had aligned, so to speak, until they ran into the Kansas City bullpen and they just couldn't get any traction. But, the point is you go through these periods of rebuilding where, you have some, the nicest way you could say it, lean years. But, you always wonder, okay, when is this going to start gaining some traction? When is this going to start looking a little bit different in a positive way? And you're hoping with Adley Rutschman's arrival, and we're going to see Grayson Rodriguez at some point, not quite as quickly as Rutschman, but I don't think it's necessarily going to be August or September either. DL Hall called up, to AAA, and he needs some time. He hasn't pitched at AAA, and keep in mind the pandemic on the pitching side, I do think has complicated things for some of these young arms. If you're a team that's already kind of being methodical in how you're trying to do this, you cancel a minor league season, that's going to mess up the timetable. But you feel like at this point, you add Adley Rutschman into the mix now, who is 24. This is a guy who's been ready for a little while. And we can talk about when they could have called him up. Could they have called him up last year from a baseball standpoint? Yeah. Did it make much sense for this team? Not really. And there was at least enough of an argument after he hadn't played in any pro games in 2020 to, give him some time to catch some of these young pitchers down below and work with them. I think there was even value to that, even if it wasn't as much value for him individually. But you get to the point now, it'll lengthen out your lineup even more. Adley Rutschman will be a very dramatic upgrade over Robinson Chirinos and Anthony Ben-Boom. I'm not exactly talking out of turn suggesting that, but what it means. It's a symbol. It's a symbol of hope. It's a symbol of, you hope, turning the corner at this point. I know Trey Mancini's talked about it a little bit. And look, what Trey's going to say publicly in front of the microphones and what he might be saying at home or when he's away from the ballpark are two different things. And we know his individual status is very much up in the air as far as whether he's going to be traded, whether he's going to be in Baltimore beyond this year. We know all that. But you do get the sense, talking to some guys in that clubhouse, that it's starting to feel a little bit different. And it's starting to feel like they're gaining some traction here and making some progress. And it's not showing up in a dramatic way in terms of wins and losses. I'd say this year they've felt a little more run-of-the-mill average bad rather than losing 110 games historically terrible bad, which is where they've been the last few years. And again,
their pitching has kept them in games the first 3
right,
weeks.
Exactly. And I'm not saying that to pat them on the back. Let's be very clear about that. They still have a long way to go. But when some of these guys start to arrive now, and you look at some of the talent that they now have at every level, and understanding not all of them are going to make it. We understand that. And we've already seen with Heston Kjerstad, the challenges he's had physically with myocarditis and having a bad hamstring injury in spring training, that he's just now getting to the point where he's hitting and doing things at extended spring training. So still going to be a while, but now we're getting to the point now with some of these guys starting to arrive, guys that have already been here for a year or two now, guys like Mountcastle and Mullins and guys who've had success at the major league level. You start adding more and more to that. It starts to feel a little bit different. And that doesn't mean that they're going to win this year. Doesn't mean they're going to win next year. But you feel like it's moving in a purposeful way now, rather than just, placeholder after placeholder after placeholder after placeholder. And, you're bringing in this guy who doesn't belong in the majors, and you're going to replace him with another guy who doesn't belong in the majors. And, there's still going to be some trades. There's still going to be some moves. I mean, I think you look at the outfield right now with someone like Anthony Santander, who's been around for several years, and knowing that they have Kyle Stowers and Kjerstad and Colton Cowser, and you go down the list, they have a lot of outfielders in their system and guys that aren't that far away. I would expect we're going to see Santander dealt at some point. But your hope is, and your expectation is, you're going to have guys that are coming to replace him who will be at least as good, and you're really envisioning being better. So that's how you're going to build this. And you look at how they've stocked their farm system. We've talked about the pitching side. It's very top heavy. You have Grayson Rodriguez, DL Hall. They are your elite pitching prospects. You have other guys, but they're not guys that are necessarily cracking the top 100 in Baseball America or Baseball Prospectus or Fangraphs, but they're very, they've concentrated very much on those college position players. We've talked about that a lot, the college hitters, with the thought that they have a higher degree of confidence in developing those guys, and you stock up your system in that way. And then come a year or two from now, hopefully when you really are starting to look like a team that is at least contending for a wild card, you can trade some of those position players for established pitching. And I think you're going to see it work out that way. Now, I still have questions in terms of when will they spend? How will they spend? Will they spend wisely if Mike Elias gets the blessing to spend money? So all those questions are there, and I still have doubts, and there's still things that I'm uncomfortable with in terms of just not knowing what it's going to look like when they're, quote, ready to win, which is always kind of a catch-22, going back to my example with the Pirates. But Adley Rutschman arriving, we can't downplay this. This is really, this was 1-1, right? This was Mike Elias when he arrived. That was the gift in his stocking, so to speak. That first Christmas when he's in the warehouse, knowing
As
that
Lou would say, this is why you did all that losing.
Yeah, well, but they're losing in 2018. That's what gifted Elias that first overall pick that in 2019. That was before he even arrived, that they were that bad to get that. So it's going to be fun. And again, Rutschman should come in, and I say this with no disrespect to Cedric Mullins or Ryan Mountcastle or Austin Hayes or Trey Mancini. Go down the list. And Santander, Rutschman should come in, and I'm not going to say immediately, but in the very near future, he should be their best player because that's how important he is. That's how much he's been hyped. Everyone who's talked about it, going back to his days at Oregon State and what he did at the collegiate level and his leadership qualities and knowing what he means, what he will mean for the pitching staff in the very near future, the Orioles should be, look at it in terms of, the way you look at free agent acquisitions. You bring in a stud free agent, Adley Rutschman, he's not a free agent, of course, but it should be that kind of magnitude, that kind of impact, that kind of magnitude on this organization, on this major league roster. And again, not saying that's going to be May and June, but over the course of this season and certainly going into next season, he should be their best player. If not, then we're going to be looking at it probably in a way that we look back at Matt Wieters, who was not a bust by any stretch of the imagination, but did Matt Wieters become Johnny Bench or Joe Mauer with power or anything like that? Not exactly. He was an all-star, all-star for a few years, but he certainly wasn't anything close to all of
What is the
Famer.
expectation? I'm just saying, because Wieters didn't live up to it, and he was 3 picks away, and he was certainly the best catcher in that draft, right?
Mm-hmm.
And they brought him along in sort of the same way. And Wieters was this big, rangy guy who you knew he wouldn't be a catcher when he was 31 or whatever. He was going to play another position. But for Rutschman offensively, I go to last year's stats, and again, it is what it is. It's 300 at bats. He hit 270. At AAA, he hit a little better, hit for power. Do you see him as a 20 home run guy here this year coming up next Monday? And by the way, Luke, I want to ask you just straight up. Next Monday, he's going to be, if you had $1 to bet, you bet it on it or no? Do you still think it's another 2 weeks away after that?
No, I don't think it's another 2 weeks away after that. I just don't know if it's going to be Monday, or do you wait to the weekend and make it a Friday? Remember, Matt Wieters made it his debut on a Friday night against the Tigers. Remember, they announced it 2 days earlier on MASN. Andy McPhail came on the broadcast. Do you do something like that, or do you just make it Monday night and let it ride for the whole homestand, and you hope you get a lot of walk-up and the weekend is packed? I do think it's going to be next homestand.
You're like, you hope you get a lot of walk-up. You hope you sell tickets.
Well,
I guess I'm not sure that people are all that engaged to be running down on a Monday night just because Adley Rutschman shows up. I think there are people, but I don't think it's as many as you think. But people went to Bowie last year to see him play and whatever. So I don't know what the immediacy would be when he's going to be here every night that you're really going to see a swell. I don't know anybody that says I'm going to go the night Rutschman comes up. I guess it'd be one of those things you check the weather. My wife and I would look and say, do we want to do it or do we not? But it has been a long. I mean, if you're an Oriole fan and you go down there and you're Moeller down there on Thursday, I went because of cochlear implants and my friends with hearing impaired children, and I had an invite, and it was a charity turn for the movie that's coming out, Rally Caps, and my friend Steve Cutler and Jody Cutler. But like Don goes, and I don't know that you make a. If you're going to go on Thursday anyway and Monday, I don't know that it's going to swell the crowd. That's an interesting assumption, and that's an assumption my dad would have made. I would have made on this radio station before the fall of all of this over the last 20. I mean, Weeders coming up was 15 years ago now, right? Like literally 13, 14 years
13,
ago?
13, 2009. I mean,
yeah.
I guess it depends on what your definition of swells the crowd. Do I think
the Weeders thing was huge. When Weeders came up, there were 35, 40,000 people there when there might have been 15 the night before. It was a huge crowd the night Weeders was there. I sat out in the outfield. There were a lot of people there. And I think we were expecting that with Rutschman, maybe, but having witnessed this the last 6, 7, 8 years, I don't know. I don't know that you can even count on that. That's going to be an interesting thing.
Well, and that's where I think that's where I'm not 100% sitting here saying that I think it's going to be the first day of the homestand. That's why I almost think for that reason, because again, it is a Monday night and it's Monday night and school's still in session. Let's face it, the weather hasn't exactly been all that great early on. No, but I'm trying to lay out all the different variables. That's where if you really
want to pat it on a Friday, right?
Well, that's where I kind of say if you want to try to pack the place, and I'm not saying 45 necessarily, but let's say you get in the high 30s, let's say, which would be a really nice crowd for where they are right now.
10,000 people come down there just because of Adley Rutschman over a 48-hour period. That's a big deal. That's only 10,000. I'm not saying sell it out. I'm just saying have a real crowd.
Right.
Have a real crowd. Don't have him show up and play on Thursday night against what we saw down there against the Twins. And if they would have brought him up on Tuesday and said Thursday he's making his debut, there were less than 5,000 people in the stadium. I don't need to.
You don't have to. I'm there. I mean,
I'm good at crowds. I did skipjack games. There might have been 3,500, 4,000 people there on Thursday night. If Rutschman was up and had a 48-hour notice, the weather was decent too on Thursday.
Yeah.
I mean, there was a shooting at the night before. There's always a shooting on Fox 45 where these people are watching this. So all of that, knowing that, I don't know that it would have. I just feel like they're dead right now. Like they're DOA from a people knowing things. Now this will be all over the news, and it'll be that's great. He's there, but are you motivated to click a ticket? Are the ticket's still $19.92? I guess all that goes away when Rutschman comes up, right? They want you to pay $24.
Well, that's the other part of this. I mean, to their credit, they actually had some decent crowds very early in the season because of the 1992 pricing.
First weekend was big, right? Yeah.
My point would have been, you should have been doing that back in 2019, and you could have done that and probably maintained a little bit better of a base. And look, I mean, there are lots of factors at work here that I still have lots of questions about and concerns about. But that's where I do kind of look at this thing and say, okay, do you want to try to have a little bit better of a crowd for the entire homestand, or do you announce Rutschman is coming up that Friday on Wednesday, and then you do it in the same way you did it for Matt Wieters, or do you announce it, as they're finishing up this current road trip, do you announce it that Saturday? Mike Elias comes on the broadcast and says, Rutschman's going to be up Monday. He's going to finish his rehab assignment with AAA Norfolk over the weekend. And then he will be called up on Monday, and then you give people 48 hours that way. I don't know I'll say this.
But you think it's next week? You do think it's next week for sure?
I'd be kind of surprised at this point,
because
especially
you bet $1 on next week. That's really what I'm trying to get at. Because everybody keeps saying imminent. I'm not down there. You're down there, right? And they're so unorthodox in everything they do. But this feels like the time.
Well, they are very quiet. Like, believe me, it's not as though Mike Elias is whispering in reporters' ears, "Hey, it's going to be this date." But
Well,
I
they're
think
terrible about creating energy. Just
but you look at
to your point, whatever they're going to do next week is going to be all the jockeying we're doing right now. They're doing the same thing. Do we want to sell tickets? Do we
right.
just want to bring them in? Is the weather going to be good? Like before that, it was we're going to start his clock and it's going to cost the old man $100 million if we bring him up in 2020. So we can't do that. So this is the time. I mean, we've been talking about this kid forever. I mean, hope by Preakness Day he's actually here playing next week. That would be great.
Well, and if he's not, you're hoping nothing's happened in terms of his triceps or anything like that. I mean, he's hit well on his rehab assignment. You look at this and let's be clear. Once he went on the rehab assignment, he needed a couple weeks of at bats. He didn't have a normal spring training. He missed all of major league camp. He got hurt right when major leaguers were reporting because the lockout had ended. So, missed his timing. So this has been his spring training, so to speak. But you kind of look at the progression. He's played a handful of games for Aberdeen, played a handful of games for Bowie, and then gets called up to AAA, which is where he finished the end of last season. Got some legitimate time there. I think I don't know what else after this week, and that's why it's my assumption. I know other reporters are in the same camp. After this week, I'm not sure what else he has to prove. You've gained the extra year of service time at this point, so it's not as though you're not really thinking in those terms, even if you're talking about service time manipulation. So, at that point, bring him up. He's your starting catcher. I'm not going to bat him clean up on day one, but I'm guessing he will ascend up the lineup if he's as good as advertised and as good as he's been in the minor leads. And
I'm laughing at his stats, by the way. His 22 stats, because he's only got like 12 at bats everywhere. He's hitting 500 at Aberdeen, 400 in Bowie, and
draws
300
walks
at Norfolk. So he ought to be good for 265 in the big leagues.
Yeah, and I never. You asked me this, and we kind of got off. We were not off topic, but we kind of went in a couple different directions. But you asked me, I don't think Adley Rutschman's going to hit 40 home runs a season. Like, I don't think he's that guy, but I do think he's a guy that could, hit 300 or somewhere close to that, high on base percentage. I do think he's a guy that's going to hit 20 plus home runs and hit doubles. And, he's runs well for a catcher. Not that he's going to steal bases, but just trying to give you the whole picture of what he is. He's very good defensively. He's considered a great leader. You're hoping, and we've even seen the improvement with the catching from a defensive standpoint, as much as it's been a black hole offensively for them. But Chirinos and Ben Boom, like they've done a nice job receiving. They've done a nice job with these pitchers. Adley Rutschman's cut from the same cloth, only better. So everything about him screams future All-Star. Does that mean he's going to be an MVP candidate? I think it's really tough to put that on any young player, let alone a catcher, which typically you're not going to see as many MVPs at that position. So I don't want to go that far, but this guy's the real deal. And everyone you talk to, I think the Matt Wieters comparisons are that's an easy comparison. I do think if you look at the Jim Callises and different Keith Law, guys like that who really track prospects and are seeing those guys and have that historical perspective. I think a lot of those guys would tell you Rutschman his bat that has a higher ceiling than Wieters did. And I think that's one reason
Wieters in full seasons, when he really came up and got normal, 260 hitter with 20 bombs. That's pretty much what he was. And
which
it
is
didn't
still
last
really
long. It didn't last 10 years. It was 260 with 20 bombs. If that's what this kid is, it's going to be a major disappointment because it was last time to some degree.
Yeah. And so much of that's the hype machine. And just think, 2009, I mean, how the internet and social media has changed even since then. So, there's a lot of pressure on Rutschman. There's no question about that. But everyone you talk to, coaches, his parents, people at Oregon State, like you go down the list. I mean, this guy's been
by the way, Rob Nyer loves him. Rob's out in Portland, and I've had all the Portland guys on. They've been talking about Rutschman forever.
Well, and I think the difference with him, and again, how he does that in the majors remains to be seen. But everything you see about him indicates that, and this wasn't really the case with Matt Wieters, but the bat is better to the degree that on nights when he's not catching, and you're going to have to give him some time off, right? You're going to have to give him some legit full days off, but you get the sense they're going to have him DH a lot, or, as he gets older, you'll probably see him play a little more first base. Now, the same things were said about Matt Wieters in 2009, and his bat he never became a first baseman because his bat didn't justify really being a first baseman. He wasn't really, the bat wasn't that good to the point where he would have been an above average first baseman. His offense would have been below average for how you generally view that position. So, we're going to have to see, and there's always unknown. We know even can't miss prospects have missed before across baseball, not even talking just the Orioles. So, but the expectations are sky high. And to this point, over now being in the organization close to 3 years, since he was drafted, there's no reason to think that he isn't ready for it. And we're going to see him. We're going to see him very soon. It's going to be a lot of fun. I think some patience is in order, that if he doesn't come up and he's not hitting 400 over his first 10 games in the majors, let's take a deep breath. But, I think there's every expectation he's going to come in the not too distant future, he's going to be their best player. And that's why you take a guy 1-1 overall. That's the kind of expectation that's there. So it's fun. Embrace that. I think he's embraced that. I think he's okay with that, by the way. He doesn't seem like someone who, feeds into it from an ego standpoint, but I think he's comfortable knowing that, people expect a lot out of me, and I expect a lot out of myself. And I pride myself in being a leader. So, I think it's going to be fun to see how this plays out. And again, from a symbolic standpoint and from just the standpoint of adding a really good player to the mix, it's going to make things a lot more interesting around these parts, even if the losing continues for at least a little while longer.
What Luke Jones does to me, first time I've Googled Matt Wieters in probably a decade, just to see how it all turned out. You know what I mean? At the end with the Cardinals, his mom's got to be ashamed of him. He only made $62 million playing baseball. That's all. 12 years, had a nice career, all that. And that still won't be good enough. Adley Rutschman has to be way better than that. And that's really, really difficult. I mean, it really is. He's already taken on an injury this year. So just confidence is there, but patience needs to be there too for any young player. And that would go in any organization, especially in a place like this where he has to be a savior in the way that Ben McDonald was, and the way that probably poor Steve Dalkowski was back before the internet was born, right?
Well, and here's a great example. We just saw, the Kansas City Royals being in town, lots of rain, doubleheader on Sunday, makeup game Monday afternoon. But, Bobby Witt, who, granted, high school player, but same draft. He was second overall. And there was even some debate for a while. Would the Orioles take Rutschman or Bobby Witt, who is a shortstop, a high school player? High school players, as opposed to a college player, is always going to have a higher ceiling, but we also know much lower floor. Well, Bobby Witt coming into Baltimore, hitting in the low 230s, and hasn't hit for a ton of power, and he's struggling. That doesn't mean he's a bust. That doesn't mean he's not going to be a future all-star, and we're not going to be talking about this. Who knows? 10 years from now, we might be saying, wow, Mike Elias made such a mistake taking Adley Rutschman over Bobby Witt. But the point is, Bobby Witt hasn't come in and completely light the house on fire. So you do need some patience. It's
different in baseball. We talk a lot of football and a little bit of baseball. With baseball, it's such an individual game, and you're graded individually and all that. It's just different than figuring out how Tyler Linderbaum's going to work out. I think that's what makes talking about sports so different over the course of years, is that you never know when a Cedric Mullins is going to put a bloom on. You never know when a John Means is going to come out of nowhere and become your best pitcher. All of that is, and we've seen that over baseball over the course of a lifetime. Very few Robin Younts come up and just do it, right? Like, just do it for 20 years. We're expecting this guy to do it for the next 5 years at least, right?
Yeah, and I'd be remiss, since they are going to St. Louis this week. Albert Pujols was a guy who showed up, and oh my gosh, this guy is one of the best players in baseball from day one. It was extraordinary. You're right. There are very few guys who are able, whether they're a Hall of Famer or whether they just become an all-star, let's say, a guy that has a more conventional, really good career as opposed to Hall of Fame. It's really difficult to do that. And you mentioned two guys. John Means was a fringe prospect, called up at the end of the 2018 season because Buck Showalter was out of pitchers. He was sitting on his couch for 2 weeks before the Orioles summoned him to Fenway Park, and he's in the All-Star game a year later. Unfortunately, Tommy John surgery right now, but we understand, that can happen. Cedric Mullins 2 years ago, 3 years ago, was being sent down to Double-A because he had struggled so much at the major league level, being Adam Jones's heir, so to speak, the successor, and got sent all the way to Double-A, and it's in the All-Star game last year. So these stories, we don't know what's going to happen. Buck used to always say this and give him a nod because look what he's doing with the Mets right now. But if we knew how it was going to play out, it'd be really boring. And guys like you and me wouldn't have anything to argue about when we're talking about.
I just Googled Nick Markakis just to see how it all ended up. He made $120 million, and he wound up having a better career than Wieters, right? Like we didn't put as much hype on him. Yeah. He was a guy. He was a nice piece to all of this. He was never going to hit 50 home runs, so we didn't look at him like that. But he was a hell of a baseball player, Nick Markakis.
He was. However, I would say with him, go back and look at what he did in his second and third season. At that point, he was on a track looking like he could be an Eddie Murray kind of hitter. I mean, that's how. And instead, those were his absolute best seasons. When you take into account OPS, on base percentage,
driving in 100 runs, hitting a ton, 50 doubles. I mean,
23 homers, right? But that was the peak for him. Now that said, the level of consistency for him for so long. I mean, this is a guy. Go look at how many career hits he had. I mean, this is a guy. If he had really wanted to
400 career hits, 2388. Yeah.
If he had really wanted to grind it out and try to play until he was 40 or in his early 40s, he would have had an outside chance at getting to 3,000 hits, which would have been crazy, right? Because at no point, other than maybe year 2 and year 3, when he's that young and doing what he did at that age, at no point would anyone have ever said Nick Markakis is a Hall of Famer. But he would have had an outside shot at 3,000 hits, which would have just been crazy. But that speaks to the level of consistency. But again, there you go. He's another guy that because he was so great year 2, year 3, and never really achieved that level statistically again, he was kind of viewed as a guy that, underwhelming would be fair, but a guy that was, didn't live up to some of the expectations that were created very early on, but ended up having a really strong career. And the Orioles should have re-signed after 2014, looking at it in hindsight.
And out of all these guys, Adam Jones is probably a better player than either one of them. Like, in the end, if you took all the stats, and Jones only made $100 million. Markakis actually made a whole 20% more money, $120 million. But Adam Jones was a guy that came in from elsewhere, obviously in the big deal, making that kind of a deal on Bedard. But you wind up getting someone else. And I forgot about him, right? Like, just in the acquisition mode because it came way before Showalter was around and all that. But this is what we're talking about with acquisition. You bring Rutschman up, you bring Hall up, you bring Rodriguez. That's great. Where's your Chris Davis? Where's your J.J. Hardy? Where's your Adam? Where are you going outside the organization to deal Santander and get something? Deal Mancini and get the next Adam Jones, the next Chris Davis, the next J.J. Hardy. That's the next step in this for them to take that move that Stan Charles said to me on Thursday. Hey, they're going to be pretty good in a couple of years. That's what Stan Charles told me. So Stan's been telling me that since he was on the radio in 1985. So they'll be good in a couple of years. I just think that's such BS that I don't even know what to say. They'll be good in a couple of years. But in order to be good, they're going to need to acquire more good baseball players. And I think we have in this conversation, it's been one of the best baseball conversations we've had in a long time because we really have outlined those pieces that made the last thing happen. Because it's not about one piece. Adley Rutschman come up, hit 4 1/4 and go to the Hall of Fame. They don't get some pitching and they'll get some other players. They need more than just him. This is a first piece. And I don't want to say they're on the clock. They're always on the clock for me because they charge major league prices and they act like jerks. So they're always on the clock with me. But in this particular case, this is where the clock starts for a lot of people. This is where a lot of people next week say, all right, I'll go back to the ballpark to see this guy. I'll start paying attention again. I'll start we have a reason to believe other than watching Chirinos and these guys play every night.
Sure. And look, there's already some guys that are here that look like they very well could be part of their next playoff contender. I mean, Ryan Mountcastle's pretty good. Cedric Mullins is pretty good. Yeah. Going down the list. I mean, they have some good players, and even on the pitching side now, you're starting to see some bullpen arms that look. Guys, look at Batista and some different guys that they've have out there that have done nice things. But yeah, they need much more. And you're right. It's not just going to be about Adley Rutschman, Grayson Rodriguez, and DL Hall. Those 3 guys can all be all-stars, and if you don't put more talent around them and continue to complement and supplement the rest of the roster, they're not going to be good enough. But my point
is he still available?
he's still it's amazing, right? I mean, I think back to the Orioles not wanting to go to the 4th year, and to be fair to them, I think there were probably other people that would have agreed with that at the time. I mean, keep in
There's
mind,
a chance Machado would have still been here if they brought him in, because I saw the Latin thing be perceived differently, and I think getting rid of him was really it was disappointing to the players. I think. I mean, he was
oh yeah,
really a leader.
he's a great hitter and has been for a long time. And I mean, Manny Machado is still going to be. How many hundred millions are you going to throw his way? I mean, that was still going to be the ultimate factor. But you're right. But I think at this point now, again, you said it. Rutschman is kind of, I think, for a lot of people who have completely tuned this out, and I don't blame them. It's been really difficult to watch, even if you're following the minor leagues. At the major league level, it's just been brutal to watch. But Rutschman, it does feel like the beginning point for a lot of people in saying, okay, guy looks really good. He's looked good in the minors, and everyone's talking him up and all this hype, and he was 1-1. Let's see what happens from here. And it's not just him, not just how he's going to play, but what's going to happen after this. And it's why I said it's going to be fun, because, assuming he stays healthy, we're going to see Grayson Rodriguez later this season. We're going to see DL Hall later this season. And we already see Bradish, and we've already talked about some of the guys who are here already, and guys who are going to profiling to arrive either late this season or next season that should be really legitimate. So, it's very clear this farm system has a lot of talent, more talent than it's had in a very long time. Dare I say, maybe my lifetime, because you consider the mid 80s is when the talent on the farm really dried up, and at the end of 83 and, kind of going into that period of time. So there's a lot of talent, but it's got to come together. Prospects are just that until they get to the majors and you see if they're legitimate, but there's a lot of reason to be excited. Still a long way to go. Still losses ahead. I'm not going to sugarcoat that part of it, but it's starting to feel a little more purposeful in terms of what they're doing. And I think that's a sentiment I've even heard in the clubhouse. Some of the methods to their madness as far as what they're doing on the hitting side, what they're doing pitching development wise, and you're starting to see it show up. Little bits and pieces of it here and there. Again, not a great record overall. The fourth place team, that's not good enough, but they are pitching better. And we've seen the bats start to come around, and Adley Rutschman's going to be a major piece to add to that mix here in the very near future.
In our next baseball segment, we'll make fun of the Boston Red Sox for being
there.
In
You
last
go.
Place. Yeah. By the way, Nelson Cruz pushing 42 this summer, still doing it
Crazy.
down in DC. I am Nestor. He is Luke. We'll get some baseball in here, and certainly some football as well as horse racing. I have been assured by Dick Girardi that Bob Baffert will not be returning my calls this week. We'll find out. I am Nestor. We are WNST AM 1570 Towson, Baltimore, and we never stop talking little Orioles baseball and Baltimore positive.